Our speaker today is Frank Mackesy. He's retired undersheriff of Jacksonville County Sheriff's Office there was 3,000 sworn in that agency. They have a $350 million budget. He acted as a liaison to the mayor's office, the city council, federal and state legislators. Also served as an incident commander for Super Bowl 39. He's currently the chief of police at the University of North Florida. So please, everyone, please give him a warm welcome. And without further ado, here is Frank Mackesy.
Good afternoon, everybody. Woo, that thing is loud. Hey, hi, everybody. I am Frank Mackesy, and I'm from Jacksonville, Florida. I did retire from the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office, where we had a large agency, not as large as the one here, but it was a big agency by those standards. We had 3,200 people, 1,900 sworn, the rest were civilians, and we ran a jail. Now, I'm the chief of police of the University of North Florida. I have 42 officers. What I will tell you is this: the difference in collecting and analyzing high liability data is no different from that big agency to that small agency. The only difference is, in a small agency like mine, we deployed a taser not too long ago. It was the first time in 10 years. You can kind of count them on one hand. But if you have an agency that has thousands of employees out there, it's hard to do that by hand. Now, why do I have a picture of a microscope? Everything we're doing in law enforcement now, every time we turn around, there is someone looking at what we do, they're second guessing what we do, and they're always coming up for better ways on doing what we do. And I gotta tell you, fundamentally, I believe a few things about policing. I think the vast majority of the men and women that are in policing are dedicated men and women who are going to try to do the right thing, and they're going to do the job right. But I also think that there is, especially when you're in a large agency, you can have people that are hiding, not necessarily you know who they are or what they're about. And they're the ones that typically stick out there and make it tough on agencies. They do things that become public, they become notorious, they generate a lot of media, and it reflects on the entire agency. I have, can y'all hear me? I have a few concepts that I kind of fundamentally believe in as a law enforcement professional. I think that we are held to a higher standard, and I think it is important that we explain to the public what we do, we explain to the public why we do it. I also think that we've got to make sure that we're being honest with the public, and that we do communicate with the public, that we are telling them the things in a manner in which the majority of the public, the reasonably-minded people out there, believe us. What do I mean by that? I think it's organization's responsibility to create relationships within the community. And what I would tell you about that is those relationships are important before you need to withdraw goodwill from your community bank. If you're waiting until after an incident occurs to create goodwill, typically it's too late, and you're swimming against the tide. Now, I think hopefully a lot of you have heard of Gordon Graham. And one of the things I picked up from Gordon Graham about 15 years ago was the concept if you can predict it, you can prevent it. But how do you go about making predictions about people's behaviors? And I think the way you do that is through data. And what I mean by that is this: predictions come from data. Prevention comes from the way we interpret that data. So what do I mean by that? So a few years ago, I had a young officer that was working for me at the sheriff's office, and the guy kept having automobile accidents. He would just run into the car in front of him. First time it happens, he chalked it up to inexperience. Maybe he's looking at his laptop inside the car. You send him to remedial driver training, you tell him to knock it off, don't do it again, and you put him back on the street. Just for the record, very, very good cop. 6 months passes. Lo and behold, he has another accident. This time he runs into somebody else. We remediate him. We send him to more training. We take his car away for a while. Now, I don't know about your agencies, but at my agency, we had take-home cars, and if you took their car away from them, they hated that. So, we told him to knock it off. One night, I get a call about 3 o'clock in the morning. He had run his vehicle into a wall off the side of the road. So what we started doing is we had to figure out what was going on with this guy. So we had him medically tested. There was nothing there. He was a good cop. I didn't want to fire him. I wanted to salvage him because I thought he did a good job. But the thing is this, we were able to rely on our data to tell us certain things about him. And one of the things that we found out is that he was working a lot of off-duty employment, working the midnight shift. And what he was doing is those 3 accidents, he was falling asleep behind the wheel. And we're lucky that he didn't get killed or didn't kill somebody else. So that's what I mean by if you can predict it, you can prevent it. And what happened is that third time was the charm for us. It caused us to look at other things. We looked at our data within the agency. We saw some things we thought were suspicious. We questioned him about it. And lo and behold, we found out there was something going on. Now, we took his car away from him. He wasn't allowed to drive a car probably for about 6, 7, 8 years in the state of Florida. Your driver's record follows you for 7 years. So we put him on a walking beat, we put him on some special assignments, we salvaged him as a cop, but at the same time we protected our community and our agency from liability. And it was all because we had an aggregation of data that we could rely upon. So if you look at this, what this says is there's several factors of risk. You got that high risk, low frequency quadrant, you got the high risk, high frequency, and you got the low risk, low frequency, low risk, high frequency. This is all Gordon Graham stuff right here. And I can tell you, as an administrator, I embrace this within our agency. And let me tell you why. Police do an excellent job of tracking crime. They do an excellent job of putting cops on the docks. They do an excellent job of trying to get ahead of crime before it can occur. But as leaders in most agencies, we're a little suspect when it comes to recognizing at-risk behaviors that could put our agencies at risk. What are some of the things that you should be looking for? For instance, so from, 2000 to 2011, I probably have been at the scene of over 150 to 200 law enforcement officer-involved shootings. I can tell you that the use of deadly force is a high-risk, low-frequency event for a lot of agencies, but not everything may be applicable to your agency. It could be a high-risk, high-frequency event from where you're from. But the other thing I'm telling you is if you're not looking at every single one of them, you're setting your agency and your community up for failure. Vehicle pursuits resulting in injury or death. Some agencies have policies where you don't pursue at all. Where I come from, we didn't do that because I don't think it's freeze tag. Bad guys learn you can run, they're going to run. So what we do is we made sure that we devised policies designed to protect our community and our employees. And then what we did is after every pursuit, we would analyze to make sure that it was done according to policy. I already talked about employee crashes, in custody deaths, if you have a jail or, excited delirium in the back seat of a police car or whatever it may be. Some of the high risk, high frequency is use of less lethal force. Here's where data can be helpful. In my agency in Jacksonville, we implemented tasers, and we were one of the first large agencies in the state of Florida to do so. When we rolled those tasers out some, 20 years ago now, we thought we were doing the right thing. What we did is we gave all those cops tasers, taught them how to use them, told them when to use them, and put them out there in the field. Well, our community went bonkers because they thought we were going to be out there electrocuting people. So what we did is we had to pull all those tasers back in, and we did over 100 community engagements where what we did is we went out and we explained to everybody in the community why we were doing the tasers and how we were going to be using the tasers. Now, if you recall, I talked about banking that goodwill. What we had to do is we had to use some of our goodwill because we didn't do the meetings first. And some of those opinion leaders in the community were willing to listen, and they helped us after the fact. But there were segments of the Jacksonville community that thought that we were going to be using those tasers against underrepresented classes in our community, and that it would be overwhelmingly used against minorities and things of that nature. So I made the decision that we were going to document every single deployment of a taser to include red dot compliance. So when they lit that guy up with that red dot and they gave up, we consider that a taser deployment even though the probes never left the taser. So a year goes by, we tase somebody, maybe don't quite need it. The neighbors in the community and all those acronyms in our community, they go bonkers over it. And they're demanding that we pull back the tasers. We were able to show through our data that the number was like 47% of the time we could have deployed the taser and we didn't because of red dot compliance. So what it did is it undercut that popular theory out there that law enforcement was misusing a tool. You know, I have mixed emotions about all this stuff. I mean, I was never a big body camera fan. Now, one of the reasons why I wasn't a big fan is when I was at the sheriff's office, there was, 1,900 of them out there, and that's a lot of cameras, and that's a lot of storage, and that's a lot of reviewing of video and all that stuff. So I go, I retire, I'm hanging out, I'm getting bored, I get a job at this little small agency, and we start using body cameras. Now I'm on a university campus. So we're using these cameras with my 32-person law enforcement agency, and everybody's wearing a camera. In 5 years, I've had 3 complaints against police officers. 3 complaints. In all 3 instances, the incident never occurred. The students made it completely up. Nothing but lies. And I could prove it to them by showing a video. So typically the way that works is the complaining student gets called in my office. I flip my computer around. I let them watch the video. Their chin hits their chest. They apologize. Sometimes we consider charges. Sometimes we don't. But every single time they go to student conduct, they're held accountable. You see, what I come to find out is by using those body cameras, I always thought it was another element of distrust in law enforcement. What we're doing now, it's kind of like the advent of DNA evidence. If you don't have DNA nowadays, it's hard to get a conviction in a lot of things. But if you got DNA, it seems like you don't even have to testify. It takes away some of the credibility in the word of a cop when everything now has to be on video. And that's one of the reasons why I was against it. But what I also think is what those videos will show every day, inside and out, most law enforcement officers out there in the field are going to be doing the right thing. And what it does is it empowers the leadership of an agency to defend an officer that's deserving of being defended as much as we can. There's all kinds of stuff out there these days that point to agency liability. Some of the big things are the FTO and the ongoing training, the biographical information that some state laws require us to capture. There's immigration enforcement, internal affairs, the vehicle of pursuits, employee driving records. All those things point to agency liability. They just passed a law in the state of Florida where we can now make texting a primary offense. But every time we write somebody a ticket for that primary offense of texting now, we have to document their race and ethnicity on the ticket. And we have to report that to the state. My agency doesn't have a vessel for doing that. The law says it's our responsibility to figure out how we're going to get that to the state. The kind of stuff we're talking about here today solves that problem for us. So, everybody understands the importance of the FTO program and why it's important that you document the training you give officers and you rate them on a daily basis. You make a decision at the end whether or not you're going to keep them, and then they're on a probationary period. I get how important that is and why we need to do that while officers are on probation. But it doesn't do us any good to go through all that trouble if we're not properly documenting it. And it needs to be properly documented in order for us to defend against an officer doing something in the field or an officer that takes action against an agency. And the quality of the training does count. Now, the programs shouldn't just be geared toward the people out there toting the guns and driving the cars. It needs to be geared towards also your dispatchers. Some agencies call CSOs or community service officers or PSAs or the civilian employees. It still applies to all those people. And I can tell you, the better you keep your records, the more W's you get when it comes to people fighting you in the court and doing the things that they want to do in order to make it look like the agency did something wrong, as opposed that they're just not cut out to do the job. So, but what happens is we need to follow them cradle to grave. And what I mean by that is when we start, we document it when they get there. And then there's usually a breakdown once they become permanent employees. We kind of sometimes depend on the employees to keep the records themselves. Maybe they give them to us at the end of their, annual evaluation period or whatever that may be. But we need to make sure that we have those high liability areas covered. And I'll tell you why. We had an officer-involved shooting in Jacksonville. The officer did the shooting, shouldn't have shot. The sheriff made a decision to hold the individual accountable, and they lost their job. Well, because they've been on the job for so long, they had all these rights, and they have every right to initiate those rights. And that officer took us to arbitration, the whole 9 yards. Well, the arbitrator ruled against the agency, and they put the guy back to work. The sheriff wasn't happy with that, so he got his job back. He just didn't get it back where he wanted to be. That officer then reached out to the family of the person that he shot and offered to cooperate with them in their lawsuit against our agency while he's still working there. And that officer used our own training records against us in order to help that family win the lawsuit, because he said we didn't train him in certain things that we should have trained him in. We believed as an agency we did train him in those things, but it was so long ago we didn't have the empirical records to prove it. And it ended up the city had to settle the lawsuit in the long run because we didn't have the right platform to show that we had the training records. Now I can tell you, I've never heard of that happening before. I've never heard of it happening since. But what I would also ask is, if you can predict it, you can prevent it. So if you find yourself as an agency in that position, what I would suggest is, if you don't have those records, you start keeping them as soon as you can. There's areas out there of which we can do things, like some agencies in this part of the country. Where I'm from, it's really not that big of a deal, but there are brothers and sisters out there that have this same problem, and it's the immigration enforcement. And part of the deal is they're basically accusing us of being insensitive or racist or whatever it may be. And the fact of the matter is, we're just trying to do our job. And if we want to be able to show people that we're doing our job, then it's important that we keep those records. So we've been successful in the state of Florida through the Florida Chiefs of Police Association. We've been successful through the Florida Sheriff's Association, that we don't have to do the profiling. But let me tell you, it's coming. And the more I'm in this and the more I see, it is a pain in the behind. I get that. But what I'll also tell you is, I think it's coming. And for the agencies that's already doing it, I think it's smart. And this is why. I think fundamentally that police officers out there on a day in and day out basis are doing what they need to do to protect their communities, and I think they're doing it right. And all these places that screen for oversight, the DOJ coming in and looking in our agencies, all that kind of stuff, I've never really had a problem with that, because I've always believed that the agencies that I've been with were trying to do it right. And so it was always, hey, come look. And then what I find out is the data tends to prove us correct. If you've got 1,900 of anything and they're carrying badges and guns, you're going to have the knuckleheads in the group that aren't going to do it right. The data is important in that it shows for the vast majority of those officers that are out there doing it right, you've got that small percentage that's not. So it's kind of back to that red dot compliance. When we were accused of overusing the taser, what we found is that we could have used it 47% more than what we really did, and it took the wind right out of the sail of the argument, and it proved that officers are doing it the right way. But conversely to that, as law enforcement leaders, if we have an officer out there that's not doing it right, hiding behind that badge, using the color of authority to not properly apply the law, I think we want to know that too, because we want to get ahead of that before it becomes an embarrassment to our agency and it ends up costing us a lot of money. I got to tell you, I've truly evolved in this issue. When I started law enforcement in 1979, we didn't count anything. And then it went through the CompStat era when everything was getting counted. Here's the problem, I think, with forcing officers to count. Most of them want to please the boss. So that's when I've always believed that officers have the discretion to take a life. They should have discretion to decide when and where to write a ticket, when and where to stop a suspicious person, whatever it may be. And what I will tell you is this: if you start measuring things, you got to have 10 of this, 10 of that every month. Officer gets to the end of their shift, they're stopping a car, it's the end of the shift. This truly happened to me. I had a sergeant when I was a young patrol officer that made me write 10 FIRs. I had a field investigation report. I had to write 10 paying tickets, and I had to have a combination of 10 arrests, being at felony and misdemeanors, every month. I stopped the woman on the last day of my month, and I was a little behind on the ticket count. And I stopped this woman, and she had 4 kids in the back seat of the car, none of them in a child restraint device. So I said, "Ma'am, your tag's out." The reason I stopped her was for a tag, like 9 months. And you have 4 kids that aren't in child restraint devices. She said, "Officer, if you had a choice between buying a tag or a car seat or feeding those 4 mouths, what would you choose?" So I took a little heat from the sergeant because I didn't make my quota on the 10 tickets that day. The fact of the matter is, when you do that, it takes discretion out of officers that can do the things they need to do, and it just doesn't help when we put quotas on things. But the data bears it out. If you are measuring those things that your officers are doing, it shows across the board whether you are or aren't doing it right. It's becoming, every encounter with a police officer now is almost a report writing call, and that some agencies in some states have to count all kinds of biographical information on the traffic stops, citizen counters, other interactions. If you find yourself in a position where you have to count that, what I would suggest you do is you automate that. Now, let me say this about why I'm up here. The young man that owns Lefta Systems is a guy that used to work for me at the sheriff's office. He was a field training sergeant and a field training officer for our agency. He didn't like the software that we were using. He thought it was antiquated, out of date, and that it didn't do what cops needed it to do. So what he did is he created an online FTO program that he's selling all over the place. The only reason I tell you that is this: he has all these softwares out there, and the unique perspective is it's a cop doing it for cops. So it's as user-friendly as it could possibly be under the circumstances. Cops designed it for cops to use it. Now, if you're a civilian sitting out there, I don't mean to offend you in any way, but I can just tell you, when a cop hears cop did it for cops, it has weight. It carries credibility because they understand what it is we're dealing with out there. And I can tell you that when we start having to quantify everything we do, the fact of the matter is it can be difficult, it can be burdensome on your agency. I think it's important that you do that because I think, like I said, it shows we're doing it right. But also, if you're not automating it, especially if you're any size of an agency at all, it can be difficult, especially over the years. Internal affairs. So, we had an incident involving, we ended up in federal court. It was a pursuit that had gone bad, and one of the things that came up in the trial was the officer's internal affairs record. And we had kept really good internal affairs record. And we were successfully able to undermine what they were trying to say about the agency as it related to the internal affairs, because they weren't expecting us to have stuff that would show the number of times somebody's complained on, the type of complaints, the frequency of the complaints. You get the idea. And we were able to put that into the record. The problem is the officer had left the agency when it went to court for trial. So what happens is we were able to show everything we had done from an incident that had occurred like 5 years earlier based upon the records that we kept for the officer. You never know when you're going to be in a position that you're going to have to pull records that are that old. And typically, when they file for that discovery, they're going backwards in time for as long as they possibly can because they're looking for everything. They use our own systems against us. They take our policies, they look at our policies, and they ask us questions about our policies. And if we didn't do it, then we have to answer why we didn't do it. That's why I think it's important that we automate the collection of this data as much as we can. Police pursuits are a big deal, folks. There's approximately 50,000 a year with somebody being killed as a result of a police pursuit almost every day. In a third of them, innocent bystanders are the victims. Now, I can tell you when most cops sign up, they know one day they might have to do violence on somebody's behalf for a bad guy, but we never signed up to hurt the good guy. None of us. So, what should happen is when you have a policy out there, your practice should mimic that policy. But you also make sure you're documenting your training. And that documentation is things like the justification for the pursuit. Was it being monitored by a supervisor? Traffic and weather conditions documented. Does the seriousness of the crime justify the pursuit? The fact of the matter is sometimes these guys get out here, they get a little eager and they just want to run it. There used to be a time when you could do that. That day is long past. And it's important that we protect our officers and our agencies and our communities by the proper documentation. Employee driving records. I mean, we're out there rolling around every day, and we're rolling around for a very, very, very long time. And the fact of the matter is you got to document all these accidents. And there's so many things that need to be taken into consideration. Chargeable versus not chargeable. How many crashes they're having. What did you do about them? It also helps in monitoring the damage to your fleet, how much money you're spending on vehicle maintenance for collision repair and things of that nature. And then the other thing is it can point to an early warning system. So you can aggregate the data to show an officer if they're coming in late to work, they're having a certain number of crashes, they're getting complaints by citizens. All those things come into play. And if we have data that we can collate that spits out for us that says, look, here's an officer who's really been doing a good job and all of a sudden some things are happening, it gives us an opportunity to look into this. The fact is, there was a couple of instances with the sheriff's office where we found an officer that was involved in the use of deadly force. Things started happening in their career and they were really good officers, and all of a sudden he pops up in the early warning system, and we found out that he was having a hard time coping with the shooting that he was involved in, and he got shot in it too. So this was a way that we were able to provide that officer with the help that he needed in order to salvage a career, and also it helps in protecting our agency. If you don't have training software that captures all this stuff, your firearms training from cradle to grave, physical fitness, first aid, defensive tactics, driving, human diversity, you are going to have a hard time defending to your community when you've done it and how you've done it. You can say you've done it, but you don't have a record of that, it's not going to count because they're going to want to see it. So at the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office, what we did is we implemented a program called MARS, Managing At-Risk Students. And what we did is we entered into a partnership with our local school system, and we took police contacts, we took referrals, we took tardiness, we took arrests, we took traffic citations, we put them in a database and it spit out in every school in our community students that we thought were going to be at risk for bad behaviors in the school. The reason we did it is we were having a problem in the schools. So immediately what happens is we start identifying these kids, and what's sad is the program was working. The kids that were being spit out in this list were assigned to an SRO, a school resource officer. That SRO would talk to them, mentor them, spend time with them. And a lot of times they bought them shoes and clothes and food and things of that nature because the kids just didn't have it. And what happened is there were those stakeholders in the community that thought we were targeting certain aspects of our community, and we were giving them a scarlet letter. we're labeling them. Well, we're letting the data speak for itself. So I go to this meeting, I've got state representatives from this organization in my office, and they're all up in arms about this, and they're going on and on and on about how we're targeting people that shouldn't be targeted. And they were doing it based upon, basically it was race. When I told them that we were using a student identification number and that we didn't know the race or sex of our students until they showed up in the office of that SRO, it took the wind completely out of their sails. Because we were able to show through the data that we weren't targeting individuals based upon sex, race, ethnicity, any of that stuff. It showed we were using behavioral patterns to identify what they were doing, and we were trying to intervene before they ended up going to jail for a long time. Well, it wasn't good enough. They flipped the script on us, and then they went after the school, and they said that they were giving referrals to people that didn't need referrals. So we ended up having to scrap a program that was working in the community. It was keeping people out of jail. But the fact of the matter is, it protected our agency because we're able to say, here's the data, here's how we use it. We had banked it in that bank of community goodwill, and we were able to show them. And when they couldn't come after us because we're the bigger, easier target, then they went after the school board, and they were successful in what they did with the school board because they did not have the data to back up their argument. Had they had the same type of data we did, they could have successfully defended it, and that program may still be working today. So that is the importance of keeping and analyzing data as it relates to everything that you do as an agency. And you don't have to eat this apple all at one time. Eat it in bites. Start off with a training software for your FTOs and see if you like it. If it works, then go to the documentation of training software, or the use of force software, or using the softwares that are out there that relate to biographical profiling and the manner in which you're encountering citizens. If you start down that road, I would be surprised if you didn't continue down the road until you had your entire organization covered. What we do carries inherent risk. Everything that goes on within policing can be controversial, but it also can carry huge cost to an agency or a community in the forms of civil litigation. I don't have to tell the law enforcement professional in this room that, you know that. The manner, though, in which you will be judged is in those wins and losses. And if you do everything that you can to position your agency to show that you are doing things right, I truly believe that reasonably minded people will come to reasonably minded conclusions. There are some people out there that no matter what we say or what we do, we're never going to change their mind, and it's never going to change a thing. I can't worry about them. What I'm worried about is the average citizen on the street that supports law enforcement in what we do, and they're willing to give us the benefit of the doubt if we can prove we deserve the benefit of the doubt. The other thing is, if you have people in an agency carrying guns, dealing with inmates, dealing with the public records requests in the state of Florida are a nightmare. We have organizations that go around the entire state making public records requests just to figure out if we're doing it by the law, and if we're not, they sue the agencies that don't follow the public records law, and then the cities settle with them out of court because it's cheaper than going to trial, and that's how they fund their organizations. If you document the manner in which you're doing things, what you're doing is, and it sounds cold, if you're doing it right, they're going to the agency that isn't. They're shopping agencies looking for excuses. And again, I've been doing this now for almost 40 years. And I remember when an officer gave their word, you could go to court, raise your hand, and the judge is going to believe what you said. I think that day, for the most part, is no longer there. I think what we have to do as law enforcement agencies, we have to stand in our character, we have to do the right thing. But the other thing that we need to remember is every single time we're there, if we have data, what it does is I think it reinvigorates trust in law enforcement, because I believe what officers are doing out there every single day is legitimate. I think what they're doing is appropriate. I think they're doing things that are within the law, but I don't believe as agencies across the nation that we have the data to back us up. If you look at use of force is a big deal. I get it. But what I'll also tell you is this. Like I said, I've been to the scene of almost 200 law enforcement officer involved shootings. Of those 200, I bet you 197 of them were done exactly where they needed to be done. 2 or 3 out of 200 across the number of years may not have been done right. But we're dealing with human beings that are going to make mistakes. And when they make the mistakes, if you have the documentation of the other 197 that have been done right, it helps you in defending the other 3 in the event those 3 need defending. Sometimes it's just so bad, you got to take your licks. But the agency deserves, those officers that are doing it right need to know that when they're out there using force, that they have an agency support behind them. And you use this technology to show that your training works. And if you don't believe that officers resort to their training under stress, I have to tell you one quick story. I'm at a shooting. Officer's an undercover guy. He's dressed like an undercover guy, and it's a straight up drug deal. He's going to buy drugs from a guy. He goes to give the guy the money. Bad guy breaks out with a gun. It's a straight up drug ripoff. The officer has a presence of mind and throws that money on the ground. The bad guy goes for the money. When he goes for the money, he reaches under his shirt, he breaks leather, and he shoots 3 times, shooting the bad guy. The bad guy's DRT, dead right there. When I get there, there's a full magazine of bullets laying on the ground next to the dead guy. It's one of our magazines that we issue to our personnel. Now, that's not the time to ask somebody why they did something. We did a lessons learned after every one of our shootings to see what we could or couldn't have done better and what we need to do to make our officers better prepared. A few months passed and we have the lessons learned. What we found out was, under stress, that officer unloaded that gun, took a magazine out, drove it home, tap, rack, bang on that Glock, went out on target. He didn't shoot him anymore because he realized the guy was already dead. We were trying to simulate stress on our firing range. And when we were simulating that stress, we said you have 5 seconds, 3 rounds down range, eject the magazine, drive 1 home, tap rack, 2 more out on the target, 5 seconds. If you don't do it in 5 seconds, you don't qualify. It's a big deal in our world if you don't qualify. We instilled that in them so much that when he shot that bad guy, he shot him 3 times, unloaded that magazine, drove it back home, tap rack, but he didn't bang because he recognized the threat was dead. They absolutely respond to training under stress. And you need to have that training properly documented. So, I got to tell you, I've been a cop now for almost 40 years. I was talking to somebody earlier today, and in that 40 years, I bet you I worked 5 of them. And what I mean by that is I look forward to going to work every day. Some days it sucks. I get that. But I can tell you, I'm fortunate to be able to do something for as long as I did and to have loved it as much as I have. It's changed a little bit in the last 40 years. But I also think as law enforcement leaders, we have a responsibility to go along with that change that's in the best interest of our organization. And if you incorporate softwares into your systems that are designed to do the collecting and analyzing of high liability data, not only do I think it'll make that change easier for us going forward down the road, but I also think it's the right thing to do in protecting our officers, our agencies, and our communities. I'm just here to tell you, I believe in this company. I think they do a good job. I'm just throwing that out there. I hope you guys have the remainder of your trip here in Chicago is safe, and I hope you get to have some fun. Take care, and God bless.